Have you ever found something small that completely changed your life? This is the story of James, an ordinary man who discovered a secret from the past, a secret hidden inside an old desk, a secret that led him into a mystery of love, loss, and hope. And before we dive in, if you enjoy learning English through real, powerful stories, make sure to subscribe to Everyday Fluent English and hit the bell so you never miss the next story. It was a Saturday morning in early October. The sky was gray, heavy with clouds, and rain dripped from the edges of umbrellas. James didn't really plan to go outside, but he didn't like staying at home all day either. His small apartment felt too quiet, too empty. So he walked to the flea market at the edge of town. Rows of stalls stretched under wet tents. Old lamps, dusty books, cracked mirrors, and rusty tools, the kind of things people once loved but now wanted to forget. James wandered without thinking. He wasn't looking for anything. He had no shopping list. For him, flea markets were like walking through time, pieces of other people's lives left behind. He stopped in front of a stall where a heavy wooden desk stood under the rain. The wood was scratched, the drawers crooked. Nobody else looked at it. But James couldn't walk away. "Like it?" the seller asked. A man with a wet cap pulled low over his face. James shrugged. "It's, interesting. $20, and it's yours." James laughed. "It looks broken." The seller leaned forward. "It has history." "That's worth more than 20, trust me." James hesitated. He didn't need a desk. His apartment barely had space for one. But something about it, the weight, the shape, maybe even the silence around it, made him curious. "All right," he said finally. 20. Back home, James dragged the desk into his apartment. The rainwater dripped from its legs onto the carpet. He sat down and began to wipe it with an old cloth. When he tried to pull the middle drawer, it was stuck. He pulled harder. The wood groaned. Finally, with a sharp jerk, the drawer slid open, and a thin wooden panel inside shifted slightly. James froze. A secret compartment. He pushed the panel, and it slid to the side. Behind it, wrapped in dust, lay a yellow envelope. James's heart began to pound. The paper was brittle. The ink on the front faded but still readable. For Eleanor. He stared at it for a long time. Who was Eleanor? Why was this hidden? With careful fingers, he opened the envelope. Inside was a letter, written in elegant handwriting. "My dearest Eleanor, I leave tomorrow for the war. I don't know if I will return, but I want you to know that my heart belongs only to you. If fate is kind, I will come back and marry you. If not, remember that I loved you with all my soul. Forever yours." Thomas James sat back in silence. The room felt heavier, filled with the ghost of a love story that had been locked away for more than 70 years. That night, James lay awake, the letter on his bedside table. Who were Eleanor and Thomas? Did Thomas ever come back from the war? Why had the letter been hidden in the desk? The mystery grew inside him. He could almost hear the voices of Thomas and Eleanor reaching across time. And then another thought came. What if Eleanor never saw this letter? What if she lived her whole life not knowing Thomas's last words? James couldn't let it go. He decided. He had to find out. The next morning, James carried the letter in his jacket pocket as if it were made of glass. At work, he couldn't concentrate. At lunch, he barely ate. By evening, he gave up trying to live normally and walked to the public library. The building was quiet, smelling of old paper and polished wood. He explained his strange request to the librarian, a woman with kind eyes and silver hair. "I found an old letter written to someone named Eleanor from 1942. I want to know if she was real." The librarian raised her eyebrows but didn't laugh. Instead, she smiled. "You'd be surprised how many forgotten stories hide in old records. Let's see what we can find." Hours passed as James flipped through microfilm, scanned faded newspapers, and read fragile documents. His eyes burned, but he didn't care. Finally, a small article in a 1943 newspaper caught his attention. Local teacher sends hundreds of letters to soldiers. The photograph showed a young woman with soft eyes and a gentle smile. The caption read, "Miss Eleanor Vincent, age 21, Riverton Elementary School." James felt a strange warmth in his chest. This is her. This is Eleanor. But the article gave no clue about Thomas. No last name, no happy ending, just a frozen picture in time. He wrote down Eleanor's name and address from the archive. Then, with a mixture of fear and excitement, he searched newer records. And there she was. Eleanor Vincent, died at age 94, 5 years ago. James sat back in his chair. His chest tightened. It was too late to give her the letter, too late to close the circle. But then, another line in the records caught his eye. Survived by her granddaughter, Claire Vincent. James whispered the name to himself, as if saying it could bring the past closer. Claire lived just a few streets away, in his very city. The next evening, James stood outside a small brick house, his hands sweating, the letter in his pocket. The porch light was on. Curtains glowed warmly from inside. He could hear faint music, soft, classical. For a long moment he couldn't move. "What am I doing?" he thought. "I'm about to knock on a stranger's door and tell her I found a letter meant for her grandmother 70 years ago. She'll think I'm crazy." But then he pictured Thomas's handwriting. The words, "Forever yours." The love that had been hidden all these years. He knocked. The door opened, and a young woman stood there, maybe in her late 20s. She had dark hair tied in a loose bun and intelligent eyes behind simple glasses. "Can I help you?" she asked politely, though cautiously. James cleared his throat. His voice shook. "My name is James. I think I found something that belongs to your family." They sat in her living room, the letter between them on the coffee table. Claire stared at it, her fingers trembling. This is my grandmother's name." "Yes," James said softly. "I found it in an old desk." Hidden Claire unfolded the letter, her lips moving as she read. Tears filled her eyes. "I never knew. She never spoke about a Thomas. She always told us my grandfather was her only love, but—" Her voice broke. She pressed the paper to her chest. James watched silently, unsure whether he had done something wonderful or cruel. Finally, Claire looked up at him. "Thank you. You don't know what this means to me." For the next hour, they talked. Claire shared stories about Eleanor, her kindness, her strength, her love for teaching children. James listened, fascinated. The Eleanor from the article, the Eleanor from the letter, was no longer a distant figure. She was real, alive in memories. When James finally stood to leave, Claire touched his arm. "Would you, like to come back tomorrow? I'd like to show you some of her old photographs. Maybe we can find Thomas in them." James nodded, his heart beating faster. "Yes, I'd like that." That night, James lay awake again. But this time the silence felt different. Somehow, through an old desk and a forgotten letter, he was now connected not only to a story from the past, but also to someone in the present. But the question remained. Who was Thomas? Why did Eleanor never mention him? And what secret had stayed hidden for more than 70 years? The answers were waiting in Claire's old family photo albums. The next evening, James returned to Claire's house. She greeted him warmly, though her eyes were still red from crying the night before. On the table lay several thick albums, their covers worn, their pages yellow with time. "This is all I have of her life," Claire said softly. "She kept everything, photographs, newspaper clippings, even ticket stubs from movies she saw as a young woman." They opened the first album. Black and white photographs smiled up at them. Eleanor as a child in braids, Eleanor at her high school graduation, Eleanor at a church picnic. And then, a photograph from 1941. Eleanor in a white dress, standing beside a young man in uniform. James leaned closer. "Is that him?" Claire shook her head slowly. "No, that's my grandfather, George Vincent. He was a soldier too. He married her after the war. They turned more pages, but no photograph carried the name Thomas." James frowned. Had Thomas and Eleanor never even been photographed together? Was their love hidden, even in pictures? Claire bit her lip, deep in thought. "You know, my grandmother had an old box in the attic. I never opened it after she died. Maybe we should look." They climbed the narrow stairs into the dusty attic. Cobwebs hung in the corners. The smell of cedar and old fabric filled the air. In the far corner stood a small trunk with a brass lock, already broken. Claire knelt, opened it, and gasped. Inside were dozens of letters, tied together with a faded ribbon. James's heart leapt. Thomas? But no. Most were from George, her husband. Letters filled with simple affection, plans for the future, talk of marriage after the war. Still buried at the bottom of the trunk, James found one envelope with familiar handwriting. Thomas. This letter was different, shorter, sadder. "My dearest Eleanor, I fear this may be the last letter I write. The war has grown darker. If I do not return, know that I wished for nothing more than a life with you. If another man loves you as I do, promise me you will not spend your life in sorrow. Promise me you will live for both of us. Yours always." Thomas Claire read the words aloud, her voice breaking. James whispered, "So she did promise him. She lived. She married George. But she never forgot." Thomas Claire wiped her eyes. "She never told anyone. Maybe she thought people wouldn't understand. That love can belong to more than one person." For hours they sat in the attic, reading. Claire shared her childhood memories, Eleanor baking pies, Eleanor singing old songs, Eleanor's gentle laugh. James listened, his heart pulled closer to this family he had never known. At one point, Claire looked at him and smiled through her tears. "You know, if you hadn't bought that desk, I would never have known about this part of her life." James smiled back. "Maybe the desk was waiting for me. Or maybe it was waiting for you." Their eyes met, and for a moment the attic felt warmer, brighter, as if Eleanor herself were watching with approval. But questions still burned. Who was Thomas? Why had Eleanor kept his letters hidden all her life? And most of all, what had happened to him? James suggested they dig deeper. If he was a soldier, his name might be in the war records. Claire nodded. "We'll go to the archives tomorrow." The next day, they sat together in the county archives, scrolling through lists of names. Each one carried the weight of history: men who had fought, men who had died, men who had disappeared. And then they found him. Thomas Reed, private, reported missing in action, 1943. Claire's hand flew to her mouth. Missing in action, not confirmed dead, not confirmed alive. James felt a chill. So Eleanor never knew. She lived her whole life with that question. Did he die, or did he survive? The thought was heartbreaking. To love someone, lose them without an answer, and then build a new life while still carrying the ghost of the old one. After the archives, James walked Claire home. The autumn air was crisp, the leaves golden under their feet. They didn't talk much, both lost in thought. At her doorstep, Claire turned to him. "Thank you, James. I don't know why, but I feel like finding this letter has brought me closer to her. Closer than I ever was when she was alive." James nodded. "It's strange. Sometimes the past isn't really gone. It waits for us to find it." For a moment, they stood there, not wanting to say goodbye. Finally, Claire said softly, "Would you like to come by again tomorrow? Maybe for dinner?" James smiled, his heart beating fast. "I'd like that." That night, James lay in bed thinking of Eleanor, Thomas, George, and Claire. He had started with a mystery from the past, but now that mystery had opened a door to the present. Still, one question remained. If Thomas was only missing, could there still be more to his story? James couldn't shake the feeling that the letter, the desk, the discovery, none of it was an accident, and the truth about Thomas Reed might still be waiting. And that brings us to the end of today's story. What do you think? If you discovered a forgotten letter like this, would you keep it as a secret treasure or try to return it to the family? Tell me your answer in the comments. I read every one of them. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like, share it with a friend who loves English stories, and don't forget to subscribe to Everyday Fluent English for more inspiring tales. Your support helps us bring you stories that not only improve your English, but also touch your heart. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.